Welcome back to Africa Health Week. I'm Dave Sharp, your host and moderator for the event. We've already had a fascinating programme so far of presentations and speakers today. Remember, if you miss them, you can watch them again on YouTube, on the Future Health YouTube channel. All of the presentations will be there. And if you want to catch up with those, they'll be there for you to view later on. And we've got plenty coming up. I'll go to that very shortly. But just to let you know a little bit more about this platform, it's the perfect place, not just to watch our presentations, of course, but to ask questions of the presenters. You'll see the little Q&A box there. All you have to do there is type your question in, and we'll analyse those and we'll ask them of our presenters. If there's one you particularly like the look of, you can nudge it up by voting on that question. If you just want to chat with each other, of course, there's a chat facility as well and a networking room. There's so much that the platform offers. And of course, the whole driver behind this is that we can share best practice, we can innovate, we can learn from each other, we can challenge each other, of course, with the idea that we'll pull together a global community of healthcare professionals, all focused on a goal of improving health and well-being for us all. And who doesn't want that, particularly after what's been happening in the world? If you want to follow us, of course, on Twitter or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, we're using the hashtag Africa Health Week and also Future Health. So if either of those hashtags are on there, you can follow them, pick up, maybe chat online as well through social media. So as I mentioned, there's plenty coming up. Let's take a little look at the rest of today's programme. Shortly, we'll be hearing from Professor Rotimit Jaiyesimi, and he'll be talking about legal frameworks. We'll go into that in some detail. And then Kwasi Burhen will be joining us. He'll be looking at the role of mobile technology in health financing and delivery. So plenty to look forward to, not just today, but over the next couple of days as we focus on Africa. Of course, this is going out across the globe. And we've got other events coming up for you soon as well in the USA and beyond. So plenty to look forward to in our profession. So I mentioned there our next speaker, who is Professor Rotimit Jaiyesimi. He's going to be talking about the legal frameworks that drive the implementation of sustainable development goals. He is a visiting professor of the University of Ibadan. He's also an obstetrician and a gynecologist and an NHS patient safety specialist. A multi-talented person, an interesting person too, and we'll be asking questions afterwards. But first, let's hear from him now.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be in this part of the world. In the evening, it's about 5 o'clock in the United Kingdom. I am Professor Rotimit Jaiyesimi, Associate Medical Director for Patient Safety, as well as an obstetrician and gynecologist in the United Kingdom. In addition to that, a National Health Service patient safety specialist and a visiting professor in law at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. I would like to thank the organizers of the Africa Health Week series for inviting me to this conference, and I will be sharing my thoughts with you. I have no disclosure, no conflict of interest, and all I say today are my views and not the views of my employers or any of the universities I work with. The title of my talk today is "The Law as a Driver for the Achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals." And the essence of this topic is a topical issue that is meant to transform the world we live in. It's the precursor, the Millennium Development Goals that started in the year 2000, the millennium, and ended in 2015, did fail, especially in low to medium income countries. To a large extent, the failure was due to the lack of political will. And after the Millennium Development Goals came the Sustainable Development Goals, a United Nations resolution. Now, while the Millennium Development Goals targeted development countries, the Sustainable Development Goals apply to all countries. And though it's a United Nations resolution, the Sustainable Development Goals are nationally owned and country-led. So, in essence, each country has the freedom to establish its own national framework to attain the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the freedom of each country and taking into consideration issues such as resources, prioritization of tasks to be done within governments or in countries, the implementation skills of personnel, and the political will are recipes that are varying levels in different countries and likely to result in varying levels of achievement of these goals in different countries as well. So there is a great potential that many countries may not achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the outline of my talk really is to look at what the goals are, what the objectives of the goals are, the legal framework that supports it, if any, the international and national perspectives of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the law, if applicable, as a driver to achieve these goals. And we will come to a conclusion. So, the Sustainable Development Goals are a United Nations initiative developed as a follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals that ended in 2015. The Sustainable Development Goals are made up of 17 global goals with 169 targets that cover a broad range of sustainable development issues. Officially, it is known as Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This picture shows you the 17 goals, and I will take time to take us through, just by nomenclature, what the 17 goals are. The first goal talks of no poverty in any nation. The second goal is about zero hunger in any country in the world. The third goal is about good health and well-being. The fourth goal is about quality education. Goal number 5 is about gender equality, while goal number 6 is about the provision of clean water and sanitation. The SDG goal number 7 is applicable to clean energy, the use of affordable and clean energy globally. Number 8 is decent work and economic growth within nations. Goal number 9 is about industry and manufacturing, while goal number 10 is about reducing inequalities in society. The SDG goal number 11 is about sustainable cities and communities, while goal number 12 is about responsible consumption and production. Goal number 13 is about climate action, which borders on the climate change. And goal number 14 is about life under the water, that is in the sea. While goal number 15 is about life on land. And goal number 16 is about peace, justice, and strong institutions in nations. While the overarching goal number 17, is partnership for the goals. So those are essentially the 17 goals. Now, like I said, what I intend to do is to look at the legal framework, if there's any, that will help us achieve these goals. Now, the legalities are this. The Sustainable Development Goals build on the principles agreed upon under United Nations Resolution ARES 66 288, and it is popularly known as the future we want. This was a document that was released as a result of the Rio 20 Plus conference held in 2012. One would expect UN resolutions to command compliance, but is that the case? However, Articles 10 and 14 of the United Nations Charter, refer to General Assembly resolutions as recommendations. So, in effect, a United Nations resolution is a broad intergovernmental agreement, non-binding on member states, as there is no formal legal obligation for the member states to implement. And that is one of the key things I would like you to note. There is no formal legal obligation for the member states to implement any of these goals if they choose not to do so. However, the International Court of Justice has stressed that General Assembly resolutions are of a recommendatory nature. Again, just to buttress the fact that they are not legal binding. So effectively, the General Assembly has no real coercive authority, and it has no legal authority either. So this makes the importance given to the achievement of the goals subject to political commitment or the will of whatever government that is in power, or depending on the priority and resources available to these countries. So we'll be looking at the international and national perspective of the SDGs. Now, the starting point for different countries. Remember that I said the SDG goals applies to all nations in the world. And we have rich countries, we have poor countries, low to medium income countries. And the starting point differs for every country. The social awareness, the literacy rates also varies. The differences in the form of governance and government style also varies. Then the gross domestic product of countries, which determines the affordability of many of these goals, also varies. And again, the big P, the political will, our commitment varies. These differences create stumbling blocks to the success of the resolution that no one should be left behind if we achieve the SDG goals. So now that we know that the United Nations resolution that set up the Sustainable Development Goals is not legal binding, then governments can do whatever they want to do. And just like the Millennium Development Goal that was not successful, we may come to a situation come 2030 that we will also now be talking about that all the SDG goals were not achieved. And that is why I want to see if there's any way that we can use the existing law to drive the achievement or attainment of the goals. Now, if we look at this slide, it's a busy slide, and most of them come from nations and from the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Then CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Remember that one of the goals is gender equality. CRPD stands for Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it goes on and on like that. On the right column, you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the last bullet point, the CRC, is a Convention on the Rights of the Child. So these are existing laws. And I want to just look at a few of them to see if we can use them to drive the achievement of the SDG goals. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an international document adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, and it enshrines the rights and freedoms of all human beings. It was accepted by the General Assembly as Resolution 217 in 1948. So it's been in existence for a long time. ICESCR is an international human rights treaty adopted in 1966, and it's designed to ensure the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. That includes the right to education, fair and just conditions of work, an adequate standard of living, the highest possible standard of health, and social security. So many of these resolutions and treaties exist, but the sad thing is that they are not legally binding. ICERD stands for International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And it's a convention. It's not a legally binding treaty or resolution. I think I have gone over this, so I will leave it. I will exclude that. It's just to show us that there are existing treaties, agreements from the United Nations, from various organizations that one could use. So can we use existing international laws to drive the SDG goals? And I want to take our attention to the international human rights law that lays down obligations which states are bound to respect. And by becoming parties to international treaties, states assume obligations and duties under international law to respect, to protect, and to fulfill human rights. We also have the Paris Agreement, which is an agreement within the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. And I'm sure we all hear about climate change now. It's about climate change mitigation, adaptation, and how you're going to finance this particular one. And this was signed not too long ago in 2016. Now, UN resolutions, like I said, are resolutions. They are passed by the General Assembly or the Security Council. A declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like I said, has been in existence for a long time, and that is a strong tool that one can use to drive the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals in each country, if that law is put in place or if it is called to play. Sorry, I had an issue there with my cursor. International human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights. There's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Then you have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. When you look at all of this, it has impact on all the 17 goals. Now the question is, can we use any of this? Because in the absence of legal treaties or legal framework, then we are at risk of not realizing the sustainable development goals. So I want to put it to us that we can use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to achieve the sustainable development goals. I do not intend to go through the 17 goals, but I'm just going to pick two out of them. And the very first one that says no poverty, it says by the year 2030, we should have eradicated extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. Article 22 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says this: everyone, as a member of society, has the right to social security and is entitled to realization through national effort and international cooperation, and in accordance with the organization and resources of each state, of the economic, social, and cultural rights indispensable for his dignity and the free development of his personality. That is one article of the rights that one can apply to try and push forward the need to achieve the SDG Goal 1. Now, the General Assembly Resolution 2200 of 1966 reads as follows. It states parties to the present covenant, and this has to do with economic, social, and cultural rights. And it says, considering that in accordance with the principles proclaimed in the Charter of the United Nations, recognition of the inherent dignity and of equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And you may recall that peace, justice are one of the 17 development goals. Again, this recognizes that these rights derive from inherent dignity of the human person, the right to enjoy freedom from fear, persecution, war, and it goes on to say where everyone may enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. The International Convention goes on to state that realizing that the individual, having duties to other individuals and to the community to which he belongs, is under a responsibility to strive for the promotion and observance of the rights recognized in the present covenant. Now, this may look like a very busy slide, and this is just looking at goal number 1. And like I said, there are 169 targets, and the second column there shows us the targets in bullet points. 1.1 that says by 2030 eradicate extreme poverty where no one is living on less than $1.25 a day, and the indicators proportion of the population below international poverty line by sex, age, employment status, and geographical location, whether urban or rural. And the instrument that we can use to drive this, which is the third column, and by the way they've been written in acronyms or abbreviated forms, which I have tried to explain and will not do so. And the extreme column tells us the article we can use to drive the achievement or attainment of the Sustainable Development Goal. Now, this is dear to my heart, which because it's about health. And I believe that achieving good health and well-being is central to all these 17 goals. Without good health, you won't have the manpower to drive the economy. You won't have the manpower to do anything. So human health is important. And I say it's central to the attainment of these goals. And again, as you can see, the targets are there. The instruments that one can use to drive it are there. And it tells us the article numbers and the description. Uh, the references are available if required. It's a busy slide. Again, it's just to show that, yes, there are laws within what we have that we can put forward to government or use to challenge governments that are not working hard enough or putting in framework to achieve the SDG goals. I did talk about climate change, and I said this is a very topical issue, still very much so because of climate change, global warming. And we know what happened during the last presidential elections in America. It was a topical issue. It's still a topical issue in Europe and globally. Uh, and what it says is to address climate change, all countries agree to work to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and given the grave risk, to strive for a 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is, if we can get to 1.5, then we're doing very well. The agreement came into force in November 2016, and what it says, it's an agreement, but countries are being encouraged to abide by them. And these are the things one can put forward to nations to say, well, there's this agreement that, yes, you did sign into it. Yes, we know it may not be legally binding, but we know what the effect of climate or global warming has on human life, on life under the sea, and life on the land. And putting this to governments, and like I said, where the political will exists, then most countries will accede to undertaking the goal. Now, so though General Assembly resolutions may not be legally binding, they may become powerful agents of change if applied with zeal. Because Resolution 217 on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights offers us the best case of how the General Assembly resolution can be used to reinforce norms or rules of customary law. And although it's not legally binding, it has had unquantifiable influence on national constitutions, treaties, or international laws since it was established in 1948. And I will show you some examples later on. The 1961 resolution on the peaceful use of outer space was formally reasserted 2 years later, in a General Assembly Declaration on Legal Principles governing the activities of countries in the exploration and use of outer space. So, what this shows is that selected resolutions may become generally acceptable principles of law. And these are legal cases. Some judicial courts have given way to General Assembly resolutions by using them as a reference, proof, or as a substitute for international customary law. And in Texaco Overseas Petroleum Company versus Libyan Arab Republic, the arbitrator relied on the support of the General Assembly Resolution 1803 to settle the dispute. The United States Court of Appeal in 1980 accorded significant weight to the United Nations General Assembly resolutions in the case of Filatiga versus Pena Irala to prove that no country can claim the right to torture its citizens. The court referred to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, General Assembly Resolution 217, as well as General Assembly Resolution 2625 and 3452. So, from what I have said, you will find out that yes, at the outset, I said the General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. But what we have seen happen in reality is that a number of people have taken issues to the legal courts, and the legal courts have used the resolution to push forward issues that were before the courts. And that is why I believe that there is, in spite of the non-legal binding nature of the resolution, it can be used more so on human rights basis to drive the sustainable development goals. So I'm coming to an end shortly. The sustainable development goals aim to transform our world by addressing a broad range of sustainable development issues, ending poverty, ending hunger, improving our health, improving the literacy rate, education, making our cities, the cities in which we live in, sustainable, combating climate change, protecting the oceans and the forest. I'm sure most of us would have heard about the plastics that are seen in the oceans that the fish eat and they all get ill. And this affects the food chain. I mean, this is what we as human beings rely on to eat. But we are again contaminating the world by what we do. So, though the resolution is legally non binding, there are existing laws that could be used to drive the implementation of the goals. I would say knowledge is power. So, the legal community, social scientists, educationists, advocates for a transformed world must join hands to convince politicians of the need to enact policies and strategies for the implementation and delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals at international, regional, and national levels. To limit ourselves to the legal status of the General Assembly resolutions would only give us a narrow view when assessing the impact of these resolutions. So, no new laws are required. We must use the existing legal framework to drive the Sustainable Development Goals. Where necessary, we will have to make recourse to the law court and test it. And like I have shown you in those two cases, the courts upheld the resolution. So the human rights anchor all 17 goals and the 169 targets. We are in 2021. 2030 is less than 9 years away. Human rights declaration can be and should be used to press governments to take bold steps towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The goals are not hard to achieve if the will is there. And I mean, like I said, the goals can not be addressed in silos as there are interdependence between all the 17 goals. So there's need for a proper grasp of implementation science to be put in place in terms of policies, processes to address the steps required to attain the 17 development goals. I know this is a health talk and this is a health week, and that is why I'm ending my slide or my presentation with SDG 3, just to reinforce again that at the heart of the 17 goals is we need a good populace, we need a good health workforce, and good well-being in society so that we have people who can drive achieving these goals, so that we have people who enjoy the benefit of these 17 goals. So I've come to an end. That's the reference. What I have tried to do is to let us know that there are legal frameworks that we can apply, that we can encourage governments to use, that we as advocates can use to put pressure on governments to drive towards attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. I am not unmindful of the fact that, yes, there are low resource countries, but where there's the political will, where there is prioritization of the essential things, it is possible to attain the sustainable development goals. Even if we do not sustain the 17, at least if we move closer to a reasonable number of these goals, then we would have done ourselves and humanity justice. Thank you for listening to me.
And I'm delighted to say that Professor Jaiyesimi joins us now. Lovely to see you. Fascinating insight. But I've got to say, Professor, on the face of it, quite overwhelming. Ambitious, but overwhelming. Would you agree?
Most definitely. Because we've got 17 goals that are not legally binding on any nations in the world. And what I have tried to do is to see how we can impress on governments globally to make efforts to attain these goals. There are no legal frameworks. So that's why it's a little bit complex. But I'm sure with the political will backed by the courts, we'll make a headway.
Yes, and you mentioned political will. Of course, some governments seem to drive their own agenda. Maybe most do, you would argue. So do you think that maybe this has to come from the people, from the grassroots upwards? Because quite often, and you mentioned there in your presentation, it's the ordinary person that suffers when these things aren't being addressed.
Yeah, that's correct. Part of the goals, I think it's goal number 4, that has to do with education and literacy. If the populace are not literate, then they don't know what the SDG stands for. They don't even know what their human rights are. So at times it's going to be very difficult to drive from the grassroots. And that's where the role of advocates come into this. Non-governmental organizations, if you want to call them SDG champions, should be the one impressing on governments that it is important that they pay attention to these goals.
And of course, these are bodies in some countries that you could perhaps subscribe to, you could join, you could get behind, you could feel like your voice is being heard, because quite often it's frustrating. You know, a lot of this you would think is common sense. You know, it's the survival of the human race. It's the betterment of the human race. It seemed like common sense. So we shouldn't really be having the conversation, but we are. But with these people, we can empower them so that we can be heard, and then change will happen.
That's correct, yes. And I think the more we talk about it, so in conferences such as this, the more people will get to know about it, the more governments will get to know about it, and the more actions will be taken. Like I said, we've only got 9 years to 2030. So I think there's some degree of urgency to try and address these issues.
I mean, I was delighted to see that you threaded health through those 17. I think it's probably the common denominator. You very skillfully have done that, and we are in Africa Health Week after all. Maybe that's the motivator. We've seen, haven't we, in the last 18 months since the pandemic swept the world, how important health is. And if it underpins each of those 17 or the majority of them, then that should motivate people and governments and organisations.
I think that's the key message we've got to take away from this talk. When you look at the SDG 1, which is about no poverty, where there's poverty, you're going to have poor health. If you look at hunger, zero hunger, where people live below $1 a day, their health indices is going to be appalling. When you look at gender equality, or where females don't go to school, are not well looked after, there will be health issues. When you look at conflict results in refugees, and then you have independent or displaced camps. The health in those camps are, terrible. So this is why when you look at the 17 goals, health runs across most of them, if not all of them. And that is why in the Africa Health Week, it's important we're talking about these issues.
I mentioned there that it's a challenge, it's overwhelming. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Time is almost against us. You've mentioned 9 years, and the pandemic has probably meant that we've lost a year, maybe a year and a half on some of these things. If you were to, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but if you were to prioritise, could you even choose your top three and say, well, if we achieve those, we'd be certainly a long way down the line to creating sustainability and making a better world?
Definitely the very first one I will pick is health. Most of the disease burden globally can be treated in primary care level. And if all governments can address that, then we'll be on the winning path. Secondly, I would probably say education is important. And then economic impact, creation of jobs so that there's enough money to send children to school, to put food on the table, to live in a decent house. And so that is important. I think when you have a healthy community, then you're going to have a healthy workforce, and then you'll be able to develop other things. You build your economy based on the human resources as well as natural resources you have.
We spoke there about the pandemic, and obviously that's in everyone's mind. And, the virus doesn't necessarily discriminate, although we know some people fall ill more easily than others. But when it comes to finding treatments and for the vaccine, then healthcare can discriminate. You mentioned poverty, you mentioned economic wealth. That can impact other parts of the world, and then you could say, well, I'm all right. I've had my 2 vaccines, but somebody in another country's had nothing. They've got no chance of that. Then there's, talk of viruses mutating. So it's in everyone's interest, isn't it, to come together on all of these 17?
Yes, it is in everyone's interest to come together for these 17 development goals. It is also in everyone's interest to ensure there's equity in the distribution of vaccines. Until everybody is vaccinated, no one is protected. What we currently see is the vaccine diplomacy, where even countries are hoarding, countries that have vaccinated most of their populace have a lot of stock, whereas there are other countries that don't have it. And we must not forget that the world is a small global village. Already we have variants coming in from other parts of the world into Western countries. And this is why it is important that as a human race, we address all these issues, including health, including managing and treating COVID-19. It has exposed the weakness within the health system.
You mentioned that the law can't necessarily be enforced, but there are legal frameworks. And I should imagine anybody watching this, and there will be plenty of people watching, would say, well, how do I know about what those frameworks are? You've highlighted some of them. How do I go about pushing for those legal frameworks to be implemented, to be made more robust? That's a big challenge.
It's a big challenge. And we as healthcare practitioners cannot do it alone. And this is where implementation science is important, as well as partnering with civil organizations, as well as legal authorities. I mean, the Human Rights Declaration is a big one that protects humanity from dignity, your right to good health, your right to do this, and using that framework and taking it or testing it before the courts might press the hands of government to implement these goals. And I'm sure a number of countries have tried to do that. But I think as politicians, when you stand to serve the people, why do you wait for legal frameworks to push you to deliver the goods to the people? So that's where the political will. And I think maybe we should be carrying this message, education, to the politicians so they understand. I'm not saying they don't have an understanding, but so we can engage in a dialogue with them as to why it is important that they commit a significant amount of the budget to attacking the SDG goals.
I mentioned when you joined us your impressive CV, as we would call it, of achievements and roles that you play. I'm interested to know what your personal motivation is to address this subject.
I think it's more of humanity. The Millennium Development Goal was really targeted at the low to medium income countries, and it did not succeed. And now came 2015, came the SDG goals, which is supposed to be global, irrespective of whether you're rich or poor or low income to medium income. So it's about humanity. And without good health, they say health is wealth. And that is the driving force why I have done this. Yes, I have a slightly medical legal background, and I think maybe that's partly one of the driving forces. And again, I want to see a healthy nation globally. Let me give you the example of Rwanda. I admire that country for what they have achieved in such a short time. And that's because the political will is there. So if Rwanda can do it after the civil war they have, then there's no reason why most countries shouldn't be able to do it if the will is there.
And I think on that note, what a perfect way to sum up. It can be achieved, because I'm sure, like I said at the very top of this presentation, you know, it's overwhelming, it's a challenge. Some people would say we could never do it, the time is running out, but you've just highlighted there that things can be achieved. And with people like you driving us, then I have every faith and confidence that we should remain positive and hopeful. And I want to thank you for highlighting the issues and the challenges, and more importantly, giving us that hope and the fact that there are things that the individual, that organisations, that countries, that regions and the world indeed can do. It's a pleasure speaking to you today, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and all the very best for the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you. There we are, Professor, headlining there that very fascinating presentation, as have a lot of the presentations today been incredibly insightful. If you've missed any of them, I've mentioned this before, then you can watch again each individual presentation by going to the Future Health YouTube channel and just scrolling down to look at those. And if you missed any from today, or you think you might miss tomorrow or Wednesday, then you can go there. And indeed, as this is part of a series of events across the globe, we've already been in the UK and in the Arab world, then you can catch up on those as well. We'll be in the USA next, early in September.